Hello, my name is James K. Holder II, and I'd like to welcome you to VIP 6600, section VYB. If you're watching this video, it's really intended for those in Research Focus 1, which is Global Perspectives in Climate Migration, Resilience, Relocation, and Sustainable Futures. Again, my name is James K. Holder II. This section will be co-taught by my partner Abdurrahman Baru, and also the professor and overall professor of the VIP group, Dr. Nwaye. Climate migration is a very important topic, and it's one that a lot of people haven't either heard of or haven't really taken a lot of time to think about. But I want to discuss with you briefly why it's so important and why we're having this class to discuss it now. The World Bank projects that by the year 2050, as many as 216 million people will have to migrate or be displaced from their homes due to threats from climate change. This number is primarily concentrated in the global south, which is a term we'll delve further into as we go into this presentation. Another key number is that the number of these types of threats globally has gone up by 41% since from between the years of 2008 and 2022. So that is a very big gap, causing or attributing to 32 million displacements worldwide. And we really want to analyze that. In this course, we're going to really focus on the fact that climate change is not just an independent threat, but it's also a threat multiplier. In and of itself, it could be innocuous, or it could really create the difference between life and death, or having to stay and sort of be resilient within a space or within a city or a community, or having to relocate or be displaced. And so we really want to focus on all of the factors that contribute to those decisions as a part of this course. As a brief overview, climate change in general, but specifically climate migration, has very far-reaching implications. It really discusses migrations, evacuations, movement, displacements based on things that do reflect on historical roots, but we're noticing that they're also becoming more prominent across the globe. And this is as temperatures rise, it is contributing to a variety of threats, not just the temperature itself. And we also want to recognize that within this course, human populations have always migrated for different reasons, and climate being a major reason of migration throughout from the beginning of civilization. But what is happening now is very much ramping up, and we're noticing a speed at which these types of movements are gaining that is cause for concern and really deserves consideration and potential intervention where possible. So, two things about this course is that we're going to be taking an interdisciplinary approach. We're going to discuss data. We're going to look at things like GIS, climate data, statistics, but we're also going to look at case studies. We're going to look at the stories behind why people move. We're going to look at the data and the discussion and really begin to get an understanding of why these things are happening and what can be done to help prevent or assuage the lasting and damaging effects of climate migration or climate change. This specific section of the course is funded by a grant through the Center for Teaching and Learning called USEI. And with that, we do employ a United Nations Sustainable Development Goals approach when we discuss the topics. So everything here is going to have more of a global focus, a philanthropic focus, people-centered, and sort of a justice lens on how we go about viewing the data, how we go about approaching the topics. And we will continue on with that theme, but I do want you to know that as a part of this, we want you to approach the material with a very open mind. We expect everyone to engage with the material as such, and we are looking forward to developing broader context within the discussion, and one that transcends boundaries and also sort of cultural lines and barriers that we might exist. Though this course doesn't have a formal textbook assigned to it, we will be relying on Climate and Human Migration by Robert A. McLean as sort of a guide. This is a text that is more relying on the principles of migration on their own and applying that sort of discussion topic of climate and how it influences migration. It's not a very integrated approach to studying, but we do employ lots of articles, journals, again, case studies that we're going to use throughout the course to color in, fill in the blanks, to make sure that we're having a categorical understanding and approach to this material. At the end, we want to have approached a design solution for a project that could present a solution for this topic or this problem. And it could be a global solution, it could be a localized solution, but depending on how we're moved by the material, we want to approach this with a design thinking strategy, which is really just to empathize on a topic, define a problem, ideate a potential solution, prototype that potential solution, test it, and then, if possible, implement that solution. So if you have any questions or would like any support, again, my name is James K. Holder II. We'll also be supported by Abdurrahman Guru and Dr. N.Y. Yang. And we're all available to you. We will have any data or contact information about office hours will be available on the Canvas website. So make sure that you check that for the most up-to-date information on how to reach us or also message via Canvas. Moving into the topic itself, climate justice and the migration lens. So what we want to focus on here is that climate migration is an equity and justice topic. And we will proceed and discuss exactly why this is. This next page discusses basically the world in two maps. At the top of the page, you see the world as a function of global CO2 emissions. And this is, represented by industry. This is represented by sort of advancement in technology, civilization. There are a lot of factors and contributors to why a country or a community will create more CO2 emissions. And we do presume that CO2 emissions are the contributing factor to why the Earth is warming and why we are experiencing most effects of climate change. So if you look at the map at the bottom of the page, you can see the vulnerability to climate change in a map. And as you see, those countries at the bottom of the map that did not have the most CO2 emissions are the ones who are receiving the most threats and the most challenges in the face of climate change. And that paradox is one that we want to discuss very directly in this course. We're going to move forward into the term threats, which is what we're really going to use to describe any type of issue that comes up because of climate change. Threats, as we define them, will be categorized in two different types. One is an acute threat and one is a chronic threat. So acute threats tend to be something that's more event-driven. It's very like, this just happened. Think a hurricane, think a storm that just surfaces within a span of time, a shorter span of time. A chronic threat is one that is sort of on the horizon, you see it coming, it's persistent, it's continuous. It is something that is, it may sort of go for a period of time unnoticed until it becomes a problem. And we'll discuss how that can be the issue as a function of the combination of threats. So, on one side, we have acute climate threats. Event-driven, short-term, and sudden shifts in the climate patterns that can cause immediate and severe damage. Examples of this, of course, are, like we discussed, hurricanes, but also floods, wildfires, heat waves, severe storms, and the impacts of these are really about disruption of infrastructure, obviously loss of life, damage to property, and economic losses beyond just property, right? And then we've got the time frame. This can be something that occurs instantaneously or across a period of days to weeks. And then we have chronic threats on the other side. So chronic climate threats are defined as ones that are long-term, They're gradual shifts in climate patterns that can have a cumulative and far-reaching effect. So this is, again, we're discussing over a period of time. You may not, if you're experiencing it, you might not notice that something is changing, or you might not be able to quantify or discuss exactly how it's changing over a period of time, even though you might notice some difference. Um, this is primarily described as like rising in temperatures, but also sea level rise, which is related. And then we have changes in precipitation patterns and desertification. Desertification is probably one of the fewer known terms within that, and we'll get into that further into the course. And then the impacts of this tend to be more about sort of agricultural productivity, water scarcity, displacement of populations, and ecosystem degradation. Uh, this happens over a period of months to years, decades, or even longer. So, the key differences between these two is the time scale, one being short term, while the other one is long term, and the impact severity. Acute threats can cause a sudden severe damage, and chronic threats lead to sort of widespread damage over time. So again, harder to pinpoint, but still problematic. And then the management strategies of these are acute threats are probably the ones that are most understood and known because they require the most response. They require the employment from groups like FEMA or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They require really like police and firefighters. They require a lot of sort of immediate response, and that makes that threat more visible to some extent. So a lot of people are more familiar with the chronic threats based on the fact that it's happening in a way that is sort of a call and response. Um, and then the chronic threats require sort of longer term strategies, which oftentimes can be a challenge for a variety of reasons, and we'll get into that as well. So again, with acute versus the chronic threats and interconnectedness, this is one major thing that we need to understand within this course, and this is an overall part of climate change and why it's so difficult to diagnose and understand. Climate change and climate migration tends to not follow one specific thing. It tends to be a combination of reasons why people move or why people migrate. So that is the case also with threats. It might not just be that there was a tornado or there was a hurricane, so someone up and moved. It could be a combination of chronic heat that makes that makes an area more susceptible to wildfires, right? So even we looked at just illustrations like sort of Smokey the Bear. Smokey the Bear is a really good signifier of understanding how chronic conditions or dryness, sustained elevated heat levels in combination can make an area more susceptible to wildfires from either human interaction or just like thunder, any type of sort of intervention. And so that is something that we're able to predict or understand that an area is more susceptible because of a chronic threat, that an acute threat can become more powerful or more dangerous. So we want to keep that in mind, that these things are not necessarily happening in a vacuum. So displacement takes different forms in different places. And so just to highlight a couple of key examples that you may or may not be familiar with, Hurricane Katrina is a very popular, understandable example of displacement in the United States that affected the Gulf Coast of the United States in the early 2000s. You've got Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico, with a lot of residents of Puerto Rico moving to mainland United States as a result. The California wildfires, of course, displaced a lot of people from different communities, and who some were able to relocate. I mean, we returned to their original homes, and some were not. And so one thing we'll discuss in this course as well is just the fact that we can shift from an evacuation that can also turn into migration. If you leave a place and intend to come back, if you're not able to, based on a number of factors, that ultimately becomes a form of migration. So the key themes, these are short-term evacuations that turn into permanent relocations, potentially. And also internal migration versus the ability to return. And we also want to focus on, again, because we're discussing this from a global perspective, with the Sustainable Development Goals, and also from an equity space, we also have to be sensitive to and mindful of racial and economic disparities along the lines of these topics. So, Global South is a bit different. We're talking to a broader space here and a larger range of challenges potentially. The Sahel desertification can create, and the Sahel, if you don't know, if you took a line um, across, if you take the Sahara Desert crossing North Africa and you took a line that goes right under that, that area is defined as the Sahel. And all of the countries that are under that area fall into or contain regions that are usually described as Sahel regions. So, um, what is happening there is that the desert, the Sahara Desert, is essentially expanding into countries and regions where it hadn't been before, which again goes to that agricultural piece and the ability to, or the lack of ability to now grow food or herd animals for food, and so those people have to move. This is a good example that of a location that already experienced regular migration patterns outside of climate change, right? So we want to be sensitive to those issues and sensitive to those patterns while discussing this as a climate issue. And let's say, looking down to issues like sea level rise. Sea level rise affects different types of places in different ways. It affects small islands like Fiji very differently than it affects a place like Bangladesh. And we want to discuss this term Global South a little bit more. Global South, as you can see from this map, the area that is highlighted in the red is signaling as Global South. So you see some familiar countries in there. You see Mexico, you also see a lot of the Caribbean islands that are near to the United States. But separate from that, you see South Asia, um, you see Africa, and also South America. Continents that are not major producers of CO2 emissions and also not major producers of industry. They have not benefited necessarily from the economics of industry in different stages of the Industrial Revolution. And as a result, what we're noticing is that the combined effects of just the location alongside the political and economic challenges or lack of economic industry that we see in the global north, those countries are experiencing greater challenges that are caused by emissions from countries in the global north. And so when we discuss justice issue, there should be some parity or some reckoning with the idea that if a problem is being exacerbated by an outside party, there should be some remuneration over that. There should be some way to balance the challenges that the victim is facing because of what that other party is causing potentially. So when we use the term Global South, the probably most official way to do it is by looking at a group called the Group of 77, which is actually a group of 130 plus countries that unified in the 60s under the auspice of um, the economics of being not in the primary industry of the globe. It's not a definition by the location or where they are on a map. It is a designation that is pretty much more economic, if anything, but there is a geographical component to that as well. So again, we will discuss how do we determine if a country is within the global south or not, but it is something that you will be able to know and describe by the end of this course. So going back to that initial projection that I discussed about the UN, or the World Bank rather, discussing this projection of millions, 200 plus million people migrating from their homes in the global south by 2050. This this graph here shows pessimistic versus optimistic change, meaning if things get worse, it could be worse. If we improve, if we intervene now, make things better, it could be a lot less severe than is projected. And you see Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Pacific, and also Latin America represented. On the next bar, we're going to see the types of threats that we've seen occur just within one calendar year, where they occurred, And again, we're talking about this combination of um, chronic and acute threats, acute and chronic threats, rather. And so this is outlined here in this table. This would be a good time for a break. So if you're watching this, you can pause the video, or if you'd like to continue, we'll resume on. Okay, so there's a major premise for climate change and migration as a discussion. And I want to make sure that we all know that, again, we're talking about the fact that there's never an isolated instance that causes climate migration. It is always described as a cultural, economic, political, and social factor that creates that decision, that creates that choice or that movement. This is again a part of the human experience, migration. Change, when things change, it causes people to move. But when it comes to the migration, the theories and concepts and methods used are unconnected. So fields of migration and climate change, when they're brought together, they have to encompass a broad array of topics and considerations. And that's what we will be attempting to do over the course of our studies here. This next list is one that is a total list of laws of migration by Ravenstein. This is sort of a classical approach to migration on its own. And this is a simplified version, so I'm just going to quickly go through. Most migration happens over short distances. And if you'll notice in the research as we continue on, one big statement and understanding is that most migration tends to happen within a country versus that which is international. Migration occurs in steps, meaning you're not, packing up and going all the way. You might relocate within an area and then go a little further out and then a little further out. It is it's a gradual process oftentimes. Long distance migrants usually move to major centers of economic activity. So one thing we do find, especially within climate migration, is that resilience centers are going to be responsible for accommodating many migrants, people who are moving from rural areas and typically going more towards cities for shelter or protection. Each migration flow produces a counterflow. So this is basically saying that if a group of people move into city A, then another group of people is going to move out of city A. So rural dwellers are more migratory than urban dwellers. Again, people are typically more moving towards cities than the other way around. Males are more likely to migrate internationally. And this is something we definitely see in research from the global south and other parts of the country, of the continent as well. Most migrants are adults. And then large towns grow by migration. Large towns grow more by migration than by natural increase. So what we're saying is, within a city, it's more likely that you're going to get an increase in the population from people migrating to that city than just by the people there growing their families within that city. And then the last three is migration increases with economic development. So the more developed the place becomes, the more migration it both generates and attracts. And that's something that we often see in places like Atlanta, which we will also discuss. And then migration is often motivated by economic reasons. So again, speaking back to that Sahel example, where you now no longer have the ability to farm, and as a result, you have to move because the economics of not being able to do what you do professionally it requires you to move. It requires you to find a way to make a living in another way. So that is a key example of that. And then 11, technology and transport influence migration patterns. So while not in his original formulation, modern scholars note that improved infrastructure reshapes these patterns. So that's another thing that this is again a very classic approach to migration. And so we have to view it from we have to respect the original context, but we also need to update and make sure that we're approaching it from a lens that adapts to existing technologies and opportunities for people to migrate now. And then lastly, there's going to be the geographical the geographical categories of migration, which are intra-urban migration. That's kind of that first phase, right? You're moving within an urban center. Maybe you're moving from the downtown core to midtown, or you're moving from the downtown core to the perimeter. The internal migration is, again, moving within a country. That can look very different depending on the country, right? If you move internal migration within the United States, which has a lot of different types of climate zones and different geographies and different types of people, that can be very different than moving within a smaller country that is facing threats that might be pervasive throughout that place, right? And then you've got international migration, which is sort of forced migration across a border. When you discuss that, you have to discuss, okay, if someone's leaving from a country and crossing a border, they have to be able to get into another country. So that's where policy for immigration comes in. That's where laws around travel and visas come in. And also, undocumented migration is also a part of that discussion. So these are all things that we're going to be facing as we go through this coursework. The key takeaways from this lesson should be that climate migration is multi-causal. That's the big takeaway, because again, it's never going to be, or I don't never say never, but it is the way climate migration is studied. It is understood that it is very, very unlikely that there will be one reason why a group of people decided to get up and move. Acute versus chronic threats, again, basically short-term, urgent versus long-term and pervasive. And then global inequities, discussing that paradox of the global north versus the global south, the global north contributing to a negative or untenable living situation in many cases for people and populations in the global south. And then research integration. So combining climate science with migration studies produces stronger predictive tools, which is really why we are making it a point to focus on a variety of sources, a variety of means of assessing climate change and the experiences of those facing climate migration. So in the next module, which is module 2, we'll be looking at chronic heat and infrastructure breakdown. And this is really where we start getting into a big part of the challenges that people potentially don't understand the ramifications of sustained heat level rise over the course of the next several decades. It can create big challenges associated with health, infrastructure, and also even things like electricity and the sustainability and dependability of our electrical grids. So with that said, I want to remind everybody to follow on the updates on the Canvas. This segment will be followed by a 5-question multiple choice quiz. You can take that on the Canvas. They are posted together. So if you see this, you can see that as well. And we will discuss this lecture and slides, and if you take it upon yourself to indulge in the readings, we will discuss those as well in the next section. Thank you.